When I first saw the Maddox property, it was through a windshield streaked with rain and years of neglect. The road leading there wasn't on any modern map, a narrow dirt path swallowed by oak trees that leaned so close together it felt like driving through a throat. By the time I reached the rusted gate, night had begun to creep in, slow, deliberate, and heavy, as if the land itself wanted to keep its secrets unspoken. The Maddox property wasn't something I had planned to find, it was something that found me. I'd been searching for a quiet place outside the city, a fixer-upper where I could disappear for a while, clear my head, and perhaps start over. Every listing I looked at felt sterile, over-filtered, curated to hide its flaws. But then, buried beneath hundreds of ordinary properties, one ad caught my attention: historic rural home, 2 acres, private woods, quick sale. No photos, no description beyond that, and the price was insultingly low. I called the number expecting a scam or some half-collapsed ruin, but the voice on the other end was calm, rehearsed, and strangely insistent that if I wanted to see it, I come alone. She said the place had been kept in the family and that the heirs were ready to let go for good. That phrase lingered with me as I drove out of town that morning, the city giving way to fields, then to forest, and then to something else entirely. The rain began somewhere along County Road 14, a light drizzle that blurred the horizon and turned the landscape into shades of grey and moss. My GPS lost signal as soon as I turned off the paved road, and I realized the directions the agent had given me were handwritten, an old, looping script that felt more like a warning than guidance. The path narrowed the deeper I went, the asphalt dissolving into mud and gravel, and the trees grew taller, closer, their branches knitting overhead until daylight itself seemed to wane. My headlights caught flashes of movement now and then, maybe animals, maybe tricks of the rain, but every time I slowed to look, the forest fell utterly still. It was the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath. When I reached the gate, it looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. 2 iron posts rose from the ground like bones, the metal between them coated in rust and something darker that glistened under the rain. The name Maddox was still legible, spelled out in corroded script, but most of the letters were bent or missing. I had to push the gate open with both hands, and when it finally gave, it groaned in a way that didn't sound mechanical, it sounded *tired star. Past the gate, the driveway wound uphill, weaving through overgrown grass and fallen branches, and for the first time I saw the house. It stood there like something forgotten by time itself, 2 stories of weathered wood and shuttered windows, its roof sagging slightly in the middle, the paint long peeled away until only grey boards remained. The porch was cluttered with leaves, and what might once have been a rocking chair was now just a pile of splintered wood leaning against the railing. The rain gathered in thin streams down the siding, darkening the boards so they looked almost black. Still, there was a strange beauty to it, something quiet and watchful, as though the house had been waiting for someone to return. The realtor's car sat idling at the edge of the drive, its windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. She didn't step out when I parked. Instead, she rolled her window down just enough to hand me the paperwork and keys. Her expression was strained, polite but distant, like someone trying to maintain composure during a funeral. "You can look around as long as you want," she said, though her tone suggested she hoped I wouldn't. When I asked why the price was so low, she only said the heirs wanted closure. I pressed further, half joking about ghosts or tragedies, but she shook her head quickly. "Nothing like that. They just don't remember it well. Some families prefer not to." Then she looked past me, toward the house, and her jaw tightened as if she'd seen something move in one of the upper windows. "You'll find the deed inside," she added, her voice quieter now. "They've signed everything. You just have to take possession." She didn't wait for a response. Her car backed down the drive before I could even thank her, the sound of the engine fading until only the rain remained. I was left alone with the house, its silhouette rising like a relic against the dimming sky. I stood there for a long time, keys cold in my hand, feeling something shift in the air around me. It wasn't just isolation, it was awareness, subtle and heavy, as if the house was studying me in return. When I finally stepped onto the porch, the boards flexed beneath my boots with a brittle, complaining sound. The front door was heavier than it looked, and when it opened, a wave of musty air rolled out, thick with the scent of old fabric and damp wood. Inside, the light was thin and grey. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts, disturbed by my entrance. Furniture draped in sheets lined the room, each piece shaped vaguely human in the dim light, and the wallpaper peeled in long curls, revealing older, darker layers beneath. There were signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust leading from the door to the center of the room, where a single wooden chair stood uncovered. It faced the fireplace, though no fire had burned there for years. On the mantel above it lay an old photograph in a cracked frame, a family of 5, all dressed in turn-of-the-century clothing. Their faces were strangely indistinct, blurred as though the photo had been smeared. Only the father's eyes were clear, and they seemed to look directly at me, not with welcome but with recognition. Thunder rolled outside, low and distant, and for a moment I thought I heard another sound beneath it, a faint, hollow rhythm, like footsteps on wood. I froze, listening. The sound came again, from somewhere deeper in the house, slow and deliberate. I called out, half expecting an echo, but the air swallowed my voice whole. When silence returned, it wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, like a held breath that never ended. I told myself it was just the house settling, old timber shifting in the damp. Still, when I turned back toward the doorway, I noticed something I hadn't before, the faint impression of a handprint on the inside of the front door, pressed into the dust as though someone had closed it from within not long ago. The first night in the Maddox house began with a kind of deceptive stillness, the sort that makes you think everything has settled, even as the air hums with things unseen. I had unpacked only the essentials, sleeping bag, lantern, a few tools, and decided to camp in the front room since the upstairs felt unsafe, the stairs soft with rot. The rain had stopped by then, leaving behind a cold mist that hung low across the ground outside. The windows rattled softly in their frames, and every sound in that house, every sigh, every shift of the wood, seemed amplified in the silence. The old grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped long ago, but every so often, I swore I could hear the faint tick of gears that shouldn't have been moving. I tried to distract myself by reading through the property documents the realtor had given me. Most were ordinary, transfer deeds, tax receipts, the kind of bureaucratic clutter you expect with an old estate. But one paper stood out. It wasn't official, just a page torn from some sort of journal. The handwriting was old-fashioned, slanted, and faintly smeared by water damage. Only fragments were legible, asterisk we promise not to speak of it again, payment received in full, to forget is to survive. Asterisk it felt like finding a whisper written down, something never meant for another set of eyes. I folded it away, telling myself I'd found nothing unusual, but my pulse said otherwise. When the night deepened, I turned off the lantern and lay down, listening to the soft drip of rain from the eaves. For a time, all was still. Then the house began to breathe. That's the only way I can describe it, the faint creaking, the settling of wood and wind through the cracks, but too steady, too rhythmic, as though the house itself was alive and exhaling around me. I heard it from the walls first, a subtle stretching sound that traveled from one end of the room to the other, followed by a series of light taps. At first, I thought it might be rodents or loose branches brushing the siding, but then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate, impossibly human. They began upstairs, soft enough that I questioned whether I was imagining them. The floor above me groaned with weight, a slow tread moving from one end of the hall to the other, pausing now and then, as if listening. I froze, straining to hear over the hammer of my own heartbeat. There was a long moment of silence, and then the sound began again, this time directly overhead. My hand went instinctively to the flashlight beside me, but I didn't turn it on. Some instinct deeper than fear told me not to announce I was awake. The steps moved toward the top of the staircase, each one heavier, more defined. Then came the faint rasp of something brushing against the banister, like fingertips dragging along wood. I could picture it too vividly, someone pacing slowly, testing each step before descending. My rational mind clung to explanations, old pipes, drafts, a raccoon maybe, but nothing with 4 legs moved with such measured precision. When the first stair creaked, I held my breath. Another followed. Then another. Whoever or whatever it was had begun to come down. The beam of my flashlight shook as I aimed it toward the staircase. The room at the bottom was swallowed in shadow, the faint moonlight from the window barely cutting through. The sound stopped halfway down the steps. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, a silence that * listened back star. I waited, my muscles locked, the air heavy with cold. Then came a low, drawn-out whisper. It wasn't words exactly, but it had shape and intent, like someone mouthing a name from a distance. The sound slid through the air, neither male nor female, not even human in its cadence. It was as though the house itself had found a voice, one it hadn't used in a long, long time. I stood slowly, every board underfoot threatening to give me away. My breath came shallow, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. I called out, a foolish, instinctive thing to do, but the moment the word left my lips, the whispering stopped. Absolute silence. The kind that presses against your ears until it feels like your skull is ringing. I took one step forward, and the air shifted. Something cold brushed past my leg, too distinct to be imagination. I spun, light sweeping across the room, but there was nothing. Only the chair in the center, that same uncovered chair facing the fireplace as though it had been expecting company. I told myself I was overtired, that my mind was conjuring patterns from the house's decay. Yet the sense of presence was undeniable, palpable, intimate, as if something unseen was standing just beyond the edge of light. I decided then to check the doors and windows, reassuring myself that I was truly alone. The front door was locked. The windows, though warped and cracked, were sealed tight. When I turned to head back toward my makeshift bed, I caught it, movement, fleeting and low to the floor, like a shadow slipping from one wall to another. I froze again, waiting, but it didn't return. The air grew colder still, and a thin draft carried a faint scent I couldn't identify, something earthy, old, like soil and stone after rain. I finally climbed back into my sleeping bag, keeping the flashlight on, pointed at the ceiling. I didn't sleep, not really. I drifted between half-consciousness and alertness, every creak and sigh of the house mapping itself into my mind. Somewhere near dawn, I must have dozed off, because when I woke, the rain had stopped, and light was filtering through the grimy windows. Everything was quiet again. But something had changed. The chair that had faced the fireplace was now turned slightly, angled toward where I'd been sleeping. And on the seat, resting in a small pile of dust, lay what looked like an old brass key, tarnished and unfamiliar, as though it had been placed there carefully while I slept. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach tightening with a sense of recognition I couldn't explain. There was no reason a key should unsettle me so deeply, but in that moment, I understood without logic or evidence that it belonged somewhere within the house, and that whatever I'd heard in the night hadn't simply been noise. It had been an invitation. Morning brought no comfort, only the kind of light that exposes more than it warms. The air inside the Maddox house felt heavy, still saturated with whatever had moved through it the night before. The key sat where I'd left it, on the chair in the center of the room, dulled by time but strangely warm to the touch when I picked it up. Its teeth were oddly shaped, not like any modern key, and its bow was engraved with a small symbol that looked almost like an eye, or perhaps a flame. I couldn't tell which unsettled me more. I turned it over in my hand, wondering what it could possibly unlock, and that's when I noticed something peculiar about the floorboards beneath the chair. They were misaligned, slightly raised at one end, as though something beneath them had swollen or shifted over time. When I knelt to inspect them, I saw the faint outline of a hatch. It wasn't obvious at first glance, just a subtle break in the wood's pattern, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I brushed away the dust, revealing the edge of a trap door, sealed with a single, rusted latch. I tried prying it open with my hands, but the metal wouldn't budge. The key in my pocket seemed to hum with significance, so I tried it, though the keyhole wasn't visible at first. Only when I wiped the wood with a damp cloth did I realize that one of the knot holes wasn't natural at all. It was a concealed lock, almost perfectly disguised. The key fit. It turned with a grinding sound that echoed deep below the floor, a sound that felt like waking something rather than unlocking it. The hatch opened stiffly, releasing a breath of air so cold and stale it felt like exhalation from a tomb. I hesitated at the edge, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam into the darkness below. A wooden ladder led down into what appeared to be a narrow stone cellar. I hadn't seen any sign of a basement on the blueprints, and given the house's age, I doubted anyone had been down there in decades, if ever. The sensible thing would have been to leave it alone, but curiosity is its own kind of possession. I descended. The cellar floor was uneven, made of packed dirt and rough stone. The walls dripped with condensation, and the air carried a strange metallic tang, like blood or iron. My light passed over shelves stacked with jars, some broken, some still sealed, their contents unidentifiable beneath the foggy glass. Cobwebs hung like curtains, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere beyond sight. But what drew my attention most was the chest in the center of the room. It was iron-bound, half sunk into the earth, its lid carved with the same symbol that marked the key, that same ambiguous shape, flame or eye, watching or burning. It looked ancient, far older than the house above it, as though it had been there before the Maddox family ever built their home. I knelt beside it, brushing away layers of dirt and decay, revealing more etchings along its edges, words perhaps, but so worn they were unreadable. The padlock that sealed it was massive, yet oddly, it wasn't locked. The shackle had been cut long ago, the metal corroded around the wound. For a moment, I thought it might crumble apart at my touch, but when I lifted the lid, it resisted. It took all my strength to pry it open, and when it finally gave, the sound it made was low and hollow, echoing through the cellar like the sigh of something disturbed. Inside were papers, hundreds of them, yellowed, brittle, bound with red twine. Each stack bore a name scrawled across the top, *Maddox. Winters. Clarkson. Names that meant nothing to me at first, though I'd later realize most were tied to old local families, long dead or forgotten. Beneath the documents lay a smaller box, wooden and ornate, its lid sealed with wax. Etched into it were the words *Do not remember. The handwriting was identical to the note I'd found among the property papers upstairs. My heart thudded as I broke the wax and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, written on parchment so thin they nearly crumbled in my hands. The ink had bled with time, but the first lines were still legible enough to make me wish they weren't. We made the bargain. We accepted the cost. The land will hold what we cannot bear to keep. Payment ensures silence. Forgetting is mercy. The words hit like a pulse of cold through my chest. There were more pages, each darker than the last, references to rituals, to binding, to the voices beneath the roots. One letter, dated 1913, mentioned that the house was built as a seal and that no heir shall speak of what came before. It wasn't just a family home, it was a vault. Whatever secret the Maddox heirs had been paid to forget wasn't metaphorical, it was buried here, beneath their feet, beneath mine. As I read, the air grew colder, heavy enough that my breath began to fog. Somewhere behind me, I heard the faintest shuffle of movement, like cloth brushing against stone. I turned quickly, my flashlight trembling in my grip, but there was no one there, only the faint sway of cobwebs disturbed by a breeze that shouldn't exist underground. I told myself to leave, to climb back up and seal the hatch, but something compelled me to stay, to keep reading. The last page I picked up bore only one sentence, written in shaky, uneven script, asterisk, when it wakes again, the house will remember. Asterisk. A sudden noise cut through the silence, a dull thud, followed by another. It came from the floor above, directly over my head, slow and deliberate, like footsteps pacing the living room. My throat tightened as I realized I had left the hatch open. Light from above filtered faintly through the opening, but it flickered strangely, dimming and brightening as though something passed between me and the world above. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down like weight. I forced myself up the ladder, every step groaning beneath me. When I emerged into the living room, the air was colder than before, and the light through the windows had turned a grey so thick it could barely be called daylight. The chair that had held the key was empty now, but the dust around it was disturbed. Two sets of footprints, small and bare, leading from the hatch to the corner of the room and then vanishing into the wall. I stared at them, my heart pounding, and as the realization sank in, I felt the floorboards beneath me pulse faintly, as though the house itself was breathing again, remembering exactly what it had been built to forget. The days after finding the letters blurred into one another, marked only by the shifting moods of the house. It no longer felt abandoned, it felt occupied. The air carried a constant low vibration, a hum beneath the usual sounds of creaking wood and dripping rain, as if something deep within the walls had begun to stir. I tried convincing myself that it was my imagination, that I'd let superstition take hold after discovering the cellar and the chest, but the house had a way of making denial impossible. Objects were never where I left them, doors I locked before sleeping would be open in the morning, and sometimes, faintly, I could smell smoke, wood smoke mixed with something sweeter, almost like incense or burned flowers. It came most often at night, drifting down the hall from nowhere and fading just before I could trace it. I spent hours studying the papers I'd retrieved from the cellar, piecing together the fragments of the Maddox family's strange history. Most of it read like a mixture of confession and warning. They wrote about binding the land to silence and erasing the memory that haunts the soil. There were repeated references to something they called asterisk the offering asterisk and to payment in silence, as though forgetting had been bought like property itself. The earliest letters were the most lucid, written by the patriarch, Elias Maddox, who spoke of finding something on the property long before the house was built, something they should never have unearthed. Later letters grew fragmented, erratic, as if madness had spread through the generations. By the final pages, the handwriting had deteriorated into desperate scrawls pleading for mercy from the very land they lived upon. I started to see connections between the names in the letters and the town records I'd found online before my GPS had died. Many of the families mentioned, Winters, Clarkson, Dovell, had disappeared from the area around the same time, their homes sold off, their properties left vacant. There were no obituaries, no clear records of their deaths, just silence, as though they'd been erased from history altogether. Whatever the Maddoxes had done, they hadn't done it alone. It was a pact, a collective forgetting bound to the soil itself. One night, I decided to return to the cellar, determined to look for anything I'd missed. The moment I opened the hatch, a gust of cold air rushed up, sharper than before, carrying a faint sound like whispering. I paused at the edge, listening. The sound wasn't steady, it rose and fell like the rhythm of breathing, and sometimes I could almost make out syllables, words just beyond hearing. I descended slowly, flashlight trembling in my hand. The cellar seemed smaller this time, the shadows thicker. The chest was still there, but the letters I'd left scattered on the ground had been rearranged into neat piles, the red twine wound around them again. That was when I noticed the markings on the dirt floor, circles, crudely drawn, overlapping like ripples. In the center of one circle sat a candle stub burned down to the wick, still faintly warm to the touch. I felt certain I was not alone. My light swept across the far wall, and there I saw it, something etched into the stone that hadn't been there before. The symbol from the key and chest had been carved freshly into the wall, its grooves glistening as if still wet. I backed away, heart pounding, but the whispering grew louder, echoing from within the walls themselves. The voices weren't angry, they sounded mournful, pleading. I could make out fragments now, asterisk return it, undo the silence, asterisk then, as suddenly as it began, the whispering stopped, replaced by the low, guttural sound of wood shifting above me. The house groaned, and dust rained down from the ceiling. I fled the cellar and slammed the hatch shut, pressing the latch into place with shaking hands. The whispering didn't follow, but I could still feel it, a pressure, as though the air around me had thickened. That night, sleep didn't come. I sat in the front room with the lantern burning low, watching the shadows move across the walls. Around midnight, I saw a figure pass across the window, tall, thin, and pale, like someone walking the perimeter of the house. I ran to the door, but the yard was empty, blanketed in fog so dense it seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. The mist carried that same burnt sweet smell, stronger than before, and for a moment, I thought I heard faint laughter. Not mocking, but childlike, echoing through the trees before fading into the night. The next morning, I discovered something new, a message scratched into the wallpaper near the fireplace. The letters were jagged, as though carved with a nail or knife, and they read, asterisk we forgot because we had to. Asterisk beneath the words, a handprint smeared in soot had been pressed into the wall, small, like that of a child. My stomach twisted. The Maddox family's old photographs came to mind, the ones I'd found in the cracked frame above the mantel. 5 people, parents, 2 sons, and a daughter. The youngest child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, had been standing in the center, her face blurred like the others but her posture perfectly straight, her hands clasped. It was her size, her shape, in that print. I spent the rest of the day researching every record I could find on the Maddox heirs. The family line had ended abruptly in the 1950s. The last known member, Eleanor Maddox, had sold the property under duress according to a newspaper clipping, citing the burden of inheritance as her reason for leaving. None of the heirs had returned. And though there were no recorded crimes, there were whispers in local archives of disappearances, workers, surveyors, and trespassers who had entered the property and never come out. That evening, I heard the whispering again, this time clearer. It came not from the cellar but from the walls themselves, threading through the structure like breath through lungs. I followed it down the hallway to a narrow door I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a warped cabinet, half swallowed by the wall's paneling. The knob was cold, rusted, and when I turned it, it gave way with a sound like a sigh. Inside was a narrow stairwell, spiraling upward toward the attic. I climbed slowly, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was empty except for dust, cobwebs, and a mirror standing at the far end, its surface fogged and cracked. I approached it, and for a moment, the air stilled completely. Then, faintly, I saw movement behind my reflection, 5 silhouettes standing close together, their outlines soft, indistinct. They didn't move or speak, but I felt something ripple through the air between us, a sadness so deep it pressed on my chest. Then one of the figures, or a smaller one, the child, lifted her hand and pointed downward. Not at me, but through me, toward the floor. The mirror's surface trembled, and a voice whispered close to my ear, clear as breath. Asterisk, the land remembers what we buried. Asterisk. The mirror cracked, splintering down the middle, and the light in the attic flickered out. When I stumbled back down the stairs, heart pounding, I understood what the letters had meant. The Maddox family hadn't just buried a secret. They had buried a part of themselves, something they'd been paid to forget, but that the land, bound by their pact, refused to release. I barely slept after what I saw in the attic. The whisper of that child's voice, the sight of those figures behind the mirror, they replayed endlessly in my mind, refusing to fade into dream or reason. By morning, a dull ache had taken root at the base of my skull, a pressure that pulsed in time with the creaks of the old house. I tried to tell myself I would leave, that I'd pack what little I had and drive until the road ran straight again, but something deeper, older than choice, kept me there. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was compulsion. The letters had said the land would hold what the family could not. The mirror's reflection had said the land remembered. And somewhere in that dark cellar beneath my feet was the thing it remembered too well. All morning, I heard noises beneath the floorboards, scraping, faint thuds, the shifting of earth. Once, I could have sworn I heard a voice humming a tune, the kind you might sing to a restless child. It was soft, almost tender, but every note made my stomach tighten. I tried to distract myself by wandering the property, moving through the fog-damp woods that surrounded the house. The trees grew so close together that light barely filtered through. Everything smelled of wet soil and decay. I noticed strange symbols carved into several of the trunks, the same flame-shaped eye that marked the key and the chest. Some were fresh, the bark still bleeding sap. Others had been there so long the tree had tried to heal around them. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was marked as part of the pact too, as though the boundary between the Maddox curse and the outside world had once been carefully maintained. When I returned to the house, the air inside had changed. It felt heavier, thick with humidity and the scent of old metal. Every step I took seemed to echo longer than it should have, as though the house had grown hollow inside. The key that had started everything still sat in my pocket, its weight impossible to ignore. By dusk, the pressure in my skull had become unbearable, accompanied by a sound, faint, low, a droning hum that seemed to come from below. I realized, with sick clarity, that it was resonating with the key itself. Whatever was sealed beneath the floor had begun to stir, and the key was answering. I gave in. Whether it was madness or fate, I don't know. I pulled up the hatch and descended the ladder once more, the air colder than before, the smell stronger, earth, rot, and something faintly sweet, like the scent of lilies at a funeral. The chest was still there, but now it had shifted, it no longer sat flush with the ground. Beneath it, the dirt had cracked open, and through the fissure, I could see something glinting faintly in the beam of my flashlight. I pushed the chest aside with effort, and the sound it made against the stone was deafening. The fissure widened slightly, and I saw the edge of something metallic beneath the soil. I dug with my hands, the dirt cold and damp, until I uncovered what looked like an iron lid, curved, with markings etched into its surface. It wasn't a coffin, though that was my first thought. It was more like a vault, small enough to fit a person, but shaped wrong, as though meant to contain rather than protect. The markings on its lid were the same symbols I'd seen in the woods, but beneath them were words, half erased by time, asterisk to remember is to release. Asterisk, the phrase burned through me with a clarity that overrode fear. The key in my pocket felt almost alive now, vibrating faintly against my palm. There was a lock at the front of the vault, corroded but intact, waiting for it. My hand trembled as I slid the key in. It turned easily, too easily, as though it had been waiting for me to arrive. When the lock clicked open, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was immense, absolute, the kind of silence that swallows breath and sound alike. I hesitated only a moment before lifting the lid. Inside, there was no body, no bones, no relics, only earth, dark and rich, pulsing faintly as though alive. And from that soil, shapes began to rise, thin as smoke, forming the faint outlines of faces. They weren't whole, not truly, they flickered in and out of visibility, features forming only long enough to show expressions of grief and longing before dissolving again. One face lingered longer than the rest, the little girl from the photograph, her blurred features now clear, her eyes hollow but aware. She didn't speak with her mouth, her voice filled the air around me like wind through trees. Asterisk, you've remembered, asterisk, she whispered, and the soil beneath her began to move, trembling as if exhaling after decades of stillness. I stumbled back, but the cellar itself seemed to shift, the walls bending inward. The earth under my feet pulsed like a heartbeat, faster now, harder. The whispering from before returned, but this time it was everywhere, hundreds of overlapping voices, rising in pitch until it became a wail. The figures from the soil reached upward, hands of light and ash, brushing against the ceiling, against me. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could feel their touch, cold, desperate, pleading. They weren't attacking, they were asterisk remembering asterisk, reaching through me to reclaim what had been buried in silence. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light died, the air went still, and I was alone again in the cellar. Only the chest remained, the vault gone, replaced by smooth, undisturbed soil. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, some hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when I climbed back up, the house was no longer the same. The walls that had been cracked were now pristine, the wallpaper unpeeled, the furniture upright, as though time itself had folded backward. Faint voices murmured through the air, distant laughter, the clinking of dishes, the soft rustle of movement in rooms long dead. I stood in the doorway of the living room and watched shadows move across the walls, human shapes, faintly translucent, living out their lives in silence. The Maddox family. They did not look at me. They did not seem to see me at all. They moved as if caught in an endless loop, bound to the rhythm of something older than memory. The realization came slowly, coldly, I hadn't freed them. I had asterisk reactivated asterisk what the family had sealed. The house was remembering itself, and in doing so, it had pulled me into that memory. The whispers returned then, softer now, more intimate. One voice rose above the rest, the little girl's again, close enough that I could feel her breath against my ear. Asterisk, now you belong to it too, asterisk, she said, and when I turned toward the sound, the world tilted. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was the reflection in the window, 5 figures standing behind me, their eyes bright with recognition, and my own face among them, already fading into the memory the Maddox heirs had been paid to forget.